Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us for Newsmakers. I'm Casey Counts. The New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee met in Las Cruces recently to discuss water policy and other issues facing the state. State Senator Joe Cervantes joins us today to offer his thoughts on water issues in general and the agreement reached to settle Texas v. New Mexico, a case before the U.S. Supreme Court, which has serious implications for water use in our region. Senator Cervantes, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me, Casey.
Why don't we start at that Legislative Finance Committee meeting and when you kind of got the lay of the land in terms of what the agreement between Texas and New Mexico was going to look like?
Well, since that committee meeting, we've actually heard from the special master, and we should be clear, the special master is an individual appointed by the U.S. Supreme Court to try and reconcile the claims made and to make recommendations to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that special master's report came in after the Legislative Finance Committee, but they were anticipating what that report might look like.
It's something that we've been hearing about for so long, that an agreement was close. We were getting there, and it just seems to have taken so much time. But when you really look back, and the lawsuit was filed back in 2013. So this is a decade. What has gone on during that decade of time while this was sitting before the Supreme Court?
Well, there's been a lot of litigation, a lot of court proceedings. And when you get into issues of water law, you inevitably find that cases do take many years, many decades. In fact, some of the longest cases, the longest standing cases in the federal court system are water cases. So we're seeing cases that go back to Native American rights, Pueblo rights. All of these things end up taking quite a bit of time, but what's happened is a lot of litigation.
Well, it's obviously very complicated, and you've mentioned a couple of the other interests that are involved, so I want to get back to those competing interests just a little bit later on. But maybe you can set the stage for us in terms of what was happening and why there was a lawsuit in the first place.
It's important to remember that the lawsuit was originally filed by New Mexico. Attorney General King at the time made claims against the state of Texas. As might be predicted, Texas came back with a counteroffensive and came back with quite a bit of resources, and it is the state of Texas after all. The federal government got involved, and before too long Colorado as well. So you had Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, the federal government all making various claims to the waters of the Rio Grande, and that's where the case began. Texas principally was claiming that water that was being released and due to Texas from Elephant Butte Reservoir was being intercepted by groundwater pumping below the reservoir, and that was the fundamental claim made by Texas.
Maybe you can give us some perspective going back, not that you could live in Governor King's mind, but what was the motivation there?
Well, again, we're talking about Attorney General King at the time, and fundamentally the issue oftentimes is that the folks in Santa Fe and Albuquerque and North really don't understand southern New Mexico very well, and they certainly don't understand water use in southern New Mexico. They don't generally appreciate or prioritize agricultural uses of water here in the southern part of the state, and so the focus at the time was thinking that Texas was getting more than its fair share of the water coming out of the Rio Grande.
So let's talk about the differences, across New Mexico from north to south. How would you say that the southern part of the state differs from the northern part or the central part?
It differs enormously because there is a great effort and scrutiny of the state with southern New Mexico that they don't scrutinize themselves with in the north. I routinely travel from Las Cruces to Santa Fe. When I cross the Rio Grande near Albuquerque, the ditches are full always. The Rio Grande is always full of water. Of course, we down here know that we're lucky to get 2 or 3 months of water in the Rio Grande. We're lucky to get what little water we do get in the ditches that comes from the north. All of the water that's pumped here is metered. None of the water in the northern parts of the state in many cases is metered. We have adjudications and lawsuits trying to establish water rights and claims down here. They haven't even started to try and assess those claims in what we call the middle Rio Grande, which includes Albuquerque.
Let's talk a little bit about the agreement, and the special master has recommended to the U.S. Supreme Court that it agree to the terms. We'll wait and see what happens there. Do you feel confident that the Supreme Court is going to come back and say this agreement is settled?
Well, I hope not, but I expect they probably will. I mean, the Supreme Court appointed the special master, so I would expect them to follow his recommendation. And I've read his report. It's lengthy. It's about 130 pages long. But I would expect the U.S. Supreme Court to affirm his ruling. Unfortunately, when I said I hope they don't, all the special master's ruling does is resolve our issues with Texas by creating issues internally to New Mexico. And the special master essentially says that. He says, I'm going to let you all fight that out in New Mexico.
So let's talk about the impacts for southern New Mexico, starting with agriculture. What do you see as the situation moving forward in the future for local farmers?
A lot of litigation. The special master's report essentially says, New Mexico, you have to deliver a certain amount of water to the state line at Texas. And then the special master says, we're going to leave it up to you, New Mexico, to figure out how you do that. The special master's report suggests that if we don't make that delivery, the water will come out of Elephant Butte irrigation, the farming community. The farming community is not going to take that line down, and they'll probably fight to make sure the state delivers more water to southern New Mexico.
The concept of fallowing came up during the Legislative Finance Committee, and what do you see in terms of that? Is it realistic that we're going to see a lot of farmland fallowed here in southern New Mexico?
It could be, and we've made a lot of mistakes even in that area before. So years ago, we had what was perceived to be a crisis on the Pecos over on the east side of the state. Mm-hmm. We fallowed a great deal of farmland there. The state appropriated $90 million to buy farms to fallow land on that river. After a while, the state realized that we had just bought $90 million worth of farmland that we didn't want and couldn't take care of. So we turned around and sold it after we had bought it, and we sold it back to the people who sold it to us in the first place. So, you know, there are absurdities that take place when you talk about fallowing, but it's a realistic alternative. Yeah.
So one thing that's unique about the Pecos River, right, is that it has an actual river master. Do you think that's an option for the Rio Grande?
I think the state engineer's office will probably try to do that. They'll probably try and impose an authority above and beyond the authorities that already exist down here. Again, I think that'll probably lead to litigation, and that fundamentally is the problem with our entire discussion here today in water law, which is the state and the leaders just manage the problems. They don't solve the problems. We don't really get to permanent resolution. We just kind of pass the buck and kick the can down the road.
Do you know what the solutions look like?
Yes, I do, but I'm not in charge. So, you know, the folks that are in charge, generally speaking, will try to manage the litigation. But yes, the solution is what's called adjudication. Adjudication means deciding you have a certain water right and I have a certain water right, and being clear about what those rights are. What the state does historically and the state engineer does now is really kind of gloss over that determination because we don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers.
So when it comes down to fair use, what do you think it looks like for North and Central and Southern New Mexico to work together and each get what they need to survive?
I hope that's what happens, and that's an ambitious and hopeful way of looking at it. The old expression is whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, and I think that there will always be that tension between the amount of water that's captured above southern New Mexico and kept there and that water that's ultimately delivered down here. I think that'll be a long-standing fight.
And so the origin, you know, in terms of New Mexico water law and water rights, kind of a first come, first serve, is that in its, you know, inherently bad for southern New Mexico? No,
that's actually the Constitution, and that's good for southern New Mexico. In other words, the Constitution and the law says that we rely upon what's called prior appropriation and beneficial use. In other words, who used the water first has the prior right to that, and that's the history of water in the West. That's water law in the West. New Mexico is not applying that law, and the elected officials and the people responsible for water are not applying the Constitution or the law. So they don't prioritize those who had the prior right. That prior right here in southern New Mexico belongs to the agricultural community. NMSU has a right, the city of Las Cruces has a right, the city of Las Cruces' right and the university's right is inferior to the farmer's right.
And so ultimately, when you come back to the moving forward with litigation, that's what it looks like as we move into the future, and as the interests of other people who depend on the river, other entities, are taken into account. So let's talk a little bit about the complexity of water policy in general when it comes to the interests that exist just regarding the Rio Grande alone. So you have, as you mentioned, tribal interests, as well as state interests and regional interests, and you have interstate interests, and then international interests as well. So navigating that takes, a lot of individuals. And so talk a little bit about how New Mexico's role fits into that big picture.
We're integral to the process. We're already seeing what's happening on the Colorado River, where the Colorado River is no longer able to sustain the deliveries that come off that river, including what reaches us here in southern New Mexico. It's amazing for people to always keep in mind that the entire western United States all captures its water by someplace else and moves it to where it's needed. Los Angeles relies on the Colorado River. Phoenix relies on the Colorado, and we rely on the Colorado. And the Colorado is overtaxed. So New Mexico will continue to play a critical role. And as you point out, we don't only have to deliver through New Mexico to Texas, but then on to Mexico.
Let's talk a little bit now about urban areas in our state in terms of water use. Agriculture, if I'm not mistaken, is about 80% of our state's water use. Is that number?
Yeah, that's also a fiction as well too.
Okay.
You'll often hear those statistical averages about farming taking a large percentage of the water that's used in the state, but what that number does is it counts twice the water that's removed repeatedly through the river. Let me give you an example. Rio Grande water is taken out in Albuquerque, it's used in Albuquerque, and then it's put back into the river. Then it comes down through farmland in Belen, Los Lunas, water's taken out in those places, then it's returned back to the river through channels and drainage ditches and treatment. And the same thing happens all the way down the Rio Grande. Here in Las Cruces, water is taken out near Hatch, for example. It waters the fields and then it channels its way back to the river. The agricultural component is measured at each one of those diversion points. In other words, water that's taken out at Hatch is counted, as is the water that's taken out of Macias counted. So it's repeatedly counted, but it's oftentimes the same water.
Would you offer a different number in terms of a percentage of agricultural use, say, versus urban use?
Again, it gets back to the question of what do you, I hate to sound like a lawyer, but I am. It depends on what you mean by use, which is, again, water is frequently used here by farmers, but the water runs through the fields and then runs back into drainage ditches and back into the river. So is that a use? Well, yes, of course it is, but what water is returned has to be credited against that which is diverted out of the river.
How important will conservation be moving forward?
It's critical. It's really critical, which is a great part of your program here today. We've got to recognize here in southern New Mexico that we're not doing a good enough job when it comes to conservation. Our family household water use, for example, in Las Cruces, is far higher than Santa Fe. Now, the easy response to that is, well, Santa Fe's cooler and we have greater demands on water because of our climate down here. But compare Las Cruces to El Paso. El Paso per household historically uses far less water than we do here in Las Cruces. So we're not doing a good enough job here locally, and we could do better.
Do you feel that there needs to be a heavier burden placed on urban areas in this field?
I think we all have to be partners. The ag community has to work, and I'm part of the ag community as well. Our family's part of many generations of farmers. And we've got to be partners with the city, and the city's got to likewise be part of that partnership. NMSU is a large water rights holder. The university has to be part of that partnership, and they're involved in the litigation as well too. So we've all got to work together, and that means also northern and southern New Mexico.
What about state and local governments in terms of water conservation? What do you see their roles moving forward to be?
Well, you mentioned both state and local government, so the interests are going to be diverse. I mean, the interests of the state are going to differ from the local government interests. So the city of Las Cruces wants to have adequate resources for our future and allow for expansion and growth. That's reasonable and predictable. The city will probably do what every other city has done historically in the West, which is begin to acquire those water rights. They're already doing so, buying farmland and acquiring those rights themselves. So there will be a very active role of city and county government in the water process. that I would, in my opinion, right now has not really been embraced. The city and county haven't really gotten themselves into that process much yet.
Let's get back to agriculture. In what ways do you think it will be critical for farming to change in southern New Mexico?
I think it's a great opportunity for New Mexico State and southern New Mexico to lead the state and the country really on sustainable crops and sustainable growing practices. Other countries do it well. Israel is a good example. And we could lead with crop technology, with seed selection, and all of the genetic work that's being done here at NMSU. All of these things would ideally produce what we've already done some of, which is greater yields from smaller uses of water. So it's a great opportunity for us here, and I hope we'll embrace it.
Let's talk a little bit about water and fracking. So more to the southeastern corner of the state, of course, but a fracking well can use anywhere from, say, 2 to 12 million gallons of water. How do we manage that moving forward?
It's like so much else that we do in government. We have to make a choice and consider the implications of everything you do. So, for example, it's easy to bemoan the water that's used from fracking. It is a considerable amount of water. That water becomes unusable, really, for some purposes as a result of the chemicals in the fracking process. At the same time, oil and gas production now sustains about 60% of our state budget. That's everything. That's education, universities like NMSU, our public schools, our police. Everything the state government and local government provides, about 60% of that is supported financially through the oil and gas production in our state. So you can't kill the golden goose. You know, we can say, well, we're going to limit or ban fracking or the water in fracking. Then you're going to have to find a way to make up that revenue, and that might mean taxing citizens quite a bit more than they already are.
You might be looking for more golden eggs.
We might.
What would those be other than taxes, additional taxes on citizens?
There aren't many alternatives. If you eliminate the oil and gas revenue to the state, again, you're impacting about 60% of our state budget. The alternatives are to tax citizens more and make up for that revenue in other ways. Some will argue we need greater economic diversity and more economic opportunities, and that's true too. We need to be doing a lot more there. But that's been slow, and New Mexico's really not historically made very much progress in other diverse sources of income. So again, we're relying very heavily on oil and gas, and if we're going to argue that we shouldn't be fracking or using fracking waters, there's going to be enormous trade-offs.
You mentioned the chemicals. There was just a recent report that said something like half of drinking water in our country is contaminated with PFAS. Obviously, we know that to be the case at military installations across New Mexico. I believe there are 8 in all that have PFAS, in the groundwater. What are we going to do about that?
The first thing we're going to do is recognize how much we take for granted water that we drink and we cook with and we bathe in and don't think very much about. I like thinking about the recent experience we had with COVID, where there was a near panic when people couldn't find toilet paper on the shelves. And I think all of us had that experience of having to stand in line and worrying where we would find our next roll of toilet paper. Imagine what that will be like if we're not prudent and thoughtful. What will that be like when we have to stand in line and can't get water? When we can't find cooking water, when we can't find bathing water, when we can't find a bottle of water to drink. So what is it going to look like? We have to be much more diligent about making water a priority. And I'll just tell you candidly, and I appreciate your program, candidly, the state and government generally kind of takes water for granted.
What is your role as a state lawmaker to change that?
It means coming on this program and trying to spread this message that we've got to start planning for water in our future and thinking ahead and really trying to make water a greater priority. I'll just tell you, I've been in the legislature now over 20 years. I've chaired the Committee on Water and Agriculture before. I serve on those committees. But I will tell you that there's far more attention paid to spaceport and to film and to any number of different things in the state, because whether it's marijuana or anything else, it's sexy, it captures the headlines, that people get excited about it. People take water for granted, and that's a terrible mistake.
What do you hope to see before the legislature in terms of policy?
Among the things I hope to see is an opportunity for us to have a fair dialogue. We need to recognize that the state has an entirely different set of rules for parts of the state above the reservoir and entirely different rules for those of us below the reservoir. And we're treated differently, and frankly, we're treated much more harshly. So for example, as we're farmers in southern New Mexico, all of our water is metered and accounted for by the state engineer. If you're a farmer in Belen, Los Lunas, and Socorro, who we're competing with for the same market and the same crops, their water's not metered. And so they're not subject to the same levels of control and oversight that we are down here. So we've got to start to establish some parity and some equity.
We know no one wants to live in a world without Hatch green chili.
It's true.
So what do you think, what role could those farmers play in shaping policy in the future?
Well, they're doing it. They've done a good job. The chili industry as a whole has done a good job of trying to emphasize local grown, Hatch grown chili. But the reality is most of our chili these days comes from south of the border, and we see the trucks bringing in that chili every day. We should accept those realities and recognize that there's a reason for that. The reason that chili is coming from other countries into New Mexico and the country is because we didn't plan ahead, we didn't assure the water, we didn't assure the labor, we didn't assure the level of regulation to make us competitive, and we're no longer competitive.
Do you feel that the courts are serving interests fairly and equally?
Boy, as a lawyer, I have to be really careful about how I answer that. I think the courts are trying hard to resolve these issues. What usually happens is the litigants, the parties to the lawsuit, are almost inevitably, in my experience, asking the courts for more time, asking for extensions of time, asking to kick the can down the road. And what I see inevitably is new state engineers coming in every few years, new general counsel coming in, new agency heads coming in, new board members coming in year after year, and the same thing's true of the courts. You have a judge who becomes very familiar with the issues down here about the time that they're going to retire, and then you bring in somebody new and start all over again.
So if you had your magic wand and you could shape the future of water policy in New Mexico in terms of those managers, what would that look like?
I think we have to adjudicate water rights, and politicians don't want to do that. Adjudication of water rights means, as I said earlier, recognizing you have a certain water right and I have a certain water right. And when we recognize what that is, then there's an incentive to conserve. But right now, we don't have that adjudication completed down here in the southern New Mexico, and as I said, they haven't even tried to start in the middle part of the state. So unless I know what your right is, and I know what my right is, I can't buy it, I can't sell it. There's a disincentive to conserve it because the law now incentivizes me to use it and use as much of it as I possibly can to increase my right. So the key is really to adjudicate, to make determinations about who has what right and who doesn't have what right. Politicians don't want to do that because there's winners and losers, and politics is all about making sure that nobody is ever aggrieved or a loser, and so we avoid the problem.
I think that's exactly how I phrased that topic, winners and losers. So let's talk about Texas v. New Mexico, and you can add in other court cases if you'd like to, in terms of who those winners and losers are.
Well, so we talked earlier today about how the Texas v. New Mexico case started by a lawsuit against New Mexico. Texas came back, and Texas essentially said that New Mexico was releasing the water due to Texas from the reservoir, and it was being measured there. That's where the release was being measured. Texas argued the water never actually got to the state line because it was coming down the river, and along the way, the groundwater pumping that was taking place here by farmers and by the city and by others were depleting the aquifer, and so the water in the river was then recharging that aquifer, and Texas argued that recharge was depleting the river that was actually ultimately reaching them. So the proposed consent decree that was decided by the special master will measure the Texas delivery closer to the Texas state line, really at the Texas state line, so that any depletions in the river before you get to that state line are accounted for.
Do you feel like the conditions that created that circumstance in the beginning go back to New Mexico water management?
Yes. But Texas as well too. Texas has been abusive as well. They put their wells, their city wells, in El Paso's population many times the size of Las Cruces. They put their wells on the state line, and they're tapping into our aquifer as well too. So they're clever, but they don't have clean hands. They're certainly as egregious as anyone in abusing water and water rights.
Well, I'd like to spend our last couple of minutes just talking about water scarcity, and especially in the face of a warming Earth. We just hit, new record temperatures for the globe. I think it was 63 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds lovely right about now. But if you're in Antarctica, that's not a good thing. Right. So what do you think the picture looks like, Senator Cervantes, in 20 years?
It should look grim to us if we don't act promptly on climate change and prioritizing water. And as I said, I've got to tell you, water would probably rate very low on your audience's a list of priorities today. My guess is that they're watching this program because they're interested in this topic of water. But apart from those watching this program, most would not probably recognize scarcity of water, quality of water as a concern or a priority. And we've got to change that.
When you look at climate change and maybe what happened in this last legislative session or what didn't happen, what do you think the legislature is going to have to do to address that issue?
I'm afraid that the legislature will do what we've been doing the last several years, which is just throw money at the problem. Because of the massive surpluses in oil and gas revenue, and again, unprecedented, unimaginable revenue resources available to the state, the solution to most problems these days is people coming to the state saying we need money for one project or another, we need money for one incentive or the other. And so I think that's where the pressure is on the legislature, and that's where the legislature has been focused. But money's not going to give us courage, money's not going to give us vision, money's not going to give us will, and those are the things that politics today is lacking, is the courage to do the right thing, a will to do the right thing, and again, the vision from leaders to make hard decisions. We don't do that, we throw money at it.
Right, well, we'll leave it at that. Senator Joe Cervantes, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate hearing your perspective on this crucial issue.
Good to be with you,
Hope
Casey.
to see you again soon. And that's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition from 5 a.m. to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now from noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7 p.m. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Casey Counts. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.